every morning when I roll out of bed too early, and when I'm not assuming the onerous task of running this Jewish state in the middle of the Middle East, I try to write. I try to write some short stories. I write about ghosts. I write about criminals and cowboys and conquistadors, and of course about love. But most passionately, as you might imagine, I write about Israel, and I write about love. And for the last year, I've been working on a novel. I'm working on a novel. My fiction, by the way, sells dozens of copies. Dozens of copies. And the novel is set in a small suburban northern New Jersey town. In 1972, some of the people in this book you may recognize. Much of the book takes place in a conservative synagogue that looks remarkably like this synagogue. Some of it takes place in this hall. And the working title of the novel is called To All Who Call in Truth. And it's taken from a quote, which some of you may remember pre-renovation of the, right, Seth remembers, the renovation of the sanctuary, was the quote from Psalm 145, which said, "The Lord is near to all who call upon him, to all who call upon him in truth." And every day when I was a kid growing up, Leslie, we remembered that, it was right on the wall there, all right? The Lord is near to all who call upon us, all who call upon us in truth. And just the title of this work in progress shows how deeply this shul has influenced my life, who I am, the path I've chosen to follow. And yeah, it wasn't an easy path. Yes, I did get kicked out of Hebrew school. Yes, I did read my bar mitzvah in transliteration. Baruch atah, really? They couldn't teach me. Well, we have to. Well, my parsha was about the care and feeding of lepers. It was probably well off that way. And how can you not get kicked out of Hebrew school when your Hebrew school teacher is Rabbi Gurkov? Try being 11 years old and saying that with a straight face. Right? Do you remember Rabbi Gurkov? Really? Rabbi Gurkov. Mori Rabbi. Stanley Asakov. Still, this place has instilled in me a pervasive sense of community, of faith, of love for the Jewish people, and above all, for that truth, with a capital T. I grow up on the somewhat tougher side of town, maybe not as tough as your side, Mr. Mayor, but up on Laurel Avenue. It was a working class community. It still is. We were the only Jewish family on the block. Only Jewish family on the block. And there I experienced anti-Semitism pretty regularly, and sometimes on a violent basis. My father taught me how to use my fists. He was a boxer as a young man. I was not always so successful as he was. But each time I came home all bloodied and bruised, my father would take me down the basement. Down the basement, behind the stairs, in a cubby hall, was an album of photographs. Now, my father, you know, was a World War II hero. His brother, Joe, was also a World War II hero, and his brother Joe had liberated a concentration camp and had taken pictures of the concentration camp with a Polaroid camera. In this album were the pictures. And every time I'd come home beaten up like that, he would show me these pictures of the stacks of burnt bodies and the skeletons, and he would point at these pictures, my father, and say, "You see that? You see that? That is why we need a strong state of Israel." I carry those pictures with me in my phone if you want to see them afterward. They go with me everywhere. Long after that, the period of the Six-Day War, and it was the period before the war that I remember so vividly, those 3 weeks in which Israel was surrounded by Arab armies, and they thought they'd be witnessing a second Holocaust in a singular generation. No one was going to lift a finger to save the state of Israel. And yet we woke up on that seventh day to a miracle, to the paratroopers dancing at the Kotel, and I was going to be damned. I was going to be damned if someday I wasn't going to be one of those paratroopers. Now, imagine growing up in such an effervescent ebullient atmosphere of dancing in this very hall to the accompaniment of Rabbi Kalibach, listening to the angry rants of Rabbi Kahana in this hall, and the confessions of a brilliant young writer who many years later was to become my cherished friend, a man named Elie Wiesel. Imagine standing in front of the smoking rubble of this synagogue, as I did together with my USY friends, after it was burnt down by an assailant. And it was out of this Jewish cauldron that I and others emerged, some of whom, like me, moved to Israel. There we worked the fields, we served in the army, we fought in wars, we raised families, and contributed to Israeli society in manifold ways. Some gave their lives. Some of their children gave their lives. But we were determined to build our future and our children's futures far away from places like Pleasantdale in West Orange. But have we entirely? For here again is a truth. A truth. One can never leave home entirely. And part of Pleasantdale remains within me to this very day. And it's a beautiful part. It's a warm and comforting part. But it's also a part of a quickening and harrowing pain. For in many ways, those two parts of me, the American Jewish and the Israeli, are moving apart. And in many ways, they are becoming irreconcilable and even mutually antithetical. My purpose tonight is to talk about that pain openly, truthfully. And some of the things I will talk about will be difficult to hear, but Rabbi Tobin, you asked me to keep it edgy. You're going to get edge. And they'll be difficult for me to express. But I want to begin with a self-evident declaration. Much of the blame for the schisms that are occurring between American and Israeli Jews can be traced to our very own successes. Not since Talmudic times have there ever been two more successful Jewish communities. From the working class, low-profile Jews of my parents' generation who hid during Father Cochran's radio broadcasts, there emerged the single most successful American minority. Successful in the professions, successful in business and entertainment and in the arts. American humor became Jewish humor. Bagel and lox became as American as, well, pizza. Or pizza became as... I grew up in a period, believe it or not, we grew up in a period of college quotas where they kept the number of Jews low in quality universities. Today's Jews dominate those elite universities. They proliferate the media. And believe it or not, today there are 10 Jewish U.S. senators. There's a minion in the Senate. What?
If you count our way.
Yes, count their way. More important. And polls indicate that in spite of a marked rise in anti-Semitism in this country, Jews remain the most admired minority here. The great Jewish writers of my generation, Bernard Malamud, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, they all asked the same question. How can I be American and Jewish at the same time? You can summarize them all in that one question. Young American Jews today, even Orthodox Jews in this country, not only do they not ask that question, how I can be American and Jewish at the same time, they don't even understand the question. That's how successful this community has been. And then there is Israel. Israel that began in 1948 with a Jewish population of 600,000, which over the next decade absorbed 10 times that number of Jewish refugees from 70 different nations. Later, starting in 1989, in a mere decade, Israel would absorb nearly 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union. That would be the equivalent of this country absorbing 50 million immigrants in a decade. Imagine that? Today, Israel is home to the world's largest Jewish population, soon to be twice the Jewish population in the United States. We revived the Hebrew language. More people in the world speak Hebrew today than speak Swedish, Danish, and Finnish together. That's amazing. Not saying much for the Swedes. We created an army that is today more than twice as large as the British and French armies combined. We had no natural resources. We had 2 lakes. One was dead, the other is dying. And yet we created the world's most innovative society, home to hundreds of global high-tech companies, and we are forging the 21st century in just about every field. And I'm sorry, yes, our scientists have won more Nobel Prizes than our athletes have won Olympic gold medals, and only a Jewish state would be proud of that. Imagine the poor Israeli kid who comes home, hey, Mom, I won a gold medal in the Olympics. Yeah, but where's your Nobel Prize? Okay. Can't win. We are world leaders in healthcare, in longevity. If you're an American male, you want to live 8 years longer, come to me. Right? Citizen satisfaction. It was reported today that nearly 90% of Israelis are satisfied, particularly our kids are satisfied. I tell my kids all the time, stop complaining, you're satisfied. Our per capita GDP has just surpassed Italy and Japan, and we're closing in on most of Western Europe. That's an extraordinary statistic, by the way. We have the highest natural increase rate of any industrialized nation in the world by far. The average Israeli family has between 3.4 and 3.6 kids, and that is the secular families, not the religious families. America's about 1.8, Europe's about 1.2, so about 3 times the natural increase rate of Europe. And the food. Don't get me started. The food. And Israel is a democracy. It is a flagrant democracy. It is one of the 5 or 6 countries on the entire planet never to have known a second of non-democratic governance. And we are the only country on that list never to know a second of peace. That's extraordinary. And so what? With such wild American and Israeli success stories, what could possibly go wrong between us? Why aren't we waking up every single morning and saying the bracha that we are so privileged to be Jews alive at this moment in our history? And yet, there are reasons, and they are deep, and they are many. Let's begin. Let's begin with the Zionist worldview, a classic Zionist worldview. You mentioned Herzl. All right, let's start with Herzl. The classic Zionist worldview, which rejected a continued legitimacy of the diaspora. Once the Jewish state was created, the diaspora was supposed to disappear. You're not supposed to be sitting here anymore. All Jews were supposed to move to the land of Israel. Certainly, after the creation of the state, there was no excuse not to move. And so, earliest Zionist thinkers like Theodor Herzl could conceive only of a European model in which if you were Jewish, you weren't going to succeed as a Frenchman or as an Englishman. You're always going to be Jewish. That was the lesson of Dreyfus. And America, where at least in theory, if you were Jewish, you could achieve anything, that reality did not fit in with the classic Zionist model. And for that reason, among others, Herzl never once visited this country. And though many Israelis will deny this vociferously to this day, the notion of shlilat hagolah, the negation of the diaspora, is hardwired into a lot of Israeli consciousness. For them, Israel is where Jews come to thrive. And for them, diaspora is where Jews go to die, physically, if not spiritually. For Israelis, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is where one lives. Chutz la'aretz, outside of Israel, that's where one goes to shop. And then go back. But most American Jews don't even regard themselves as living in a diaspora. Many even resent the term. I would never call American Jews diaspora Jews. For them, the United States, no less than Eretz Yisrael, is the promised land. And any suggestion that they must leave it in order to be better Jews is bitterly rejected. For a period in the 1990s, I worked with Israeli President Ezer Weizmann. And he had this notion that he would convene an international conference of Jewish leaders, and together they would sign a new covenant of the Jewish people. And according to this new covenant, it had two parts. Israel would recognize legitimacy of the diaspora, and conversely, diaspora Jewish leaders would recognize Aliyah, making Aliyah to Israel, as one of the solutions for Jewish continuity. Seems simple? Neither side would sign. Neither would sign. And since then, the divisions have only widened. Assimilation has become rampant in this country, particularly among liberal American Jews, according to the studies. You know many of them. 70 to 75% intermarriage, 75% of the children of intermarriages not raised as Jews, and the average family size, again, even if both couples are Jewish, both members are Jewish, 1.2 children per family, small family sizes, and the biggest problem of all is non-marriage. Young Jews, liberal Jews not getting married at all. And Israel, meanwhile, has grown more and more traditional. According to some estimates, a future generation not too long from now, 1/3 of all Israeli elementary school children will be ultra-Orthodox. Both American and Israeli Jews have grown more affluent, but while most American Jews are at least one generation removed from the working class, his father was a carpenter, her mother was a mechanic, right? Most Israelis are still blue-collar. We actually have a social and economic gap between us. And frankly, in this country, you want to find a Jewish mechanic or a Jewish carpenter, chances are he's an Israeli. True? A locksmith, I know. A locksmith. And we do not remember one another's past. You know, for American Jews, the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s stands as the most sacred moment in our recent historic memory. And yet you ask Israelis if they've ever heard of Selma, they think you're talking about someone's cousin in Long Island. Most American Jews, by contrast, have little or no recollection of Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, much less our withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000. Both of those withdrawals were undertaken to bring about peace. We did not get peace. We got thousands and thousands of rockets fired on our communities. Many American Jews don't remember the Second Intifada, the Palestinians' response to our peace offers, our two-state offers of 2000 and 2001, and more than 1,000 Israelis died in the Second Intifada. If in a normal society, you have the top, which is the industrial and military elite, they're usually right-wing. And at the base, you have the youth. They're usually left-wing. In Israel, it's just the opposite. We have a left-wing military and industrial elite, and we have a right-wing youth. We have a right-wing youth. You like that? Because our youth today doesn't remember the Egyptian-Israeli peace. It doesn't remember the Oslo Accords, doesn't remember Israel-Jordanian peace. What do they remember, our youth? They remember rockets on their schools, bombs in their buses. And you walk into an audience of young Israelis, you start talking about a two-state solution with the Palestinians, and they'll look at you like you're crazy. As Jews, Americans and Israelis, our collective memory has been fractured and largely forgotten. And for American Jews, especially liberal American Jews, there's perhaps no bitter issue than that of the Palestinians. For liberal American Jews, the fact that Israel has been occupying, so they say, they use the O word, occupying another people for more than 50 years is indefensible. Settlements are seen as land grabs. Jerusalem should be some way divided with the Palestinian capital in the east. But for the majority of Israelis, settlements represent the newest iteration of the Zionist idea. To them, the fact that there is a Palestinian majority in what we call Judea and Samaria, not the West Bank, that's irrelevant. If that had been the consideration in 1948, because the Israeli state that came into being in 1948 had a Palestinian majority as well, we wouldn't have a Jewish state at all today. It's not a relevant claim. Relatively few Israelis believe in the danger of Israel becoming a binational state. And for the majority of Israelis, Israel has at least as much right to Hebron and Bethlehem, both of them in Judea and Samaria, both on the West Bank, than it does to Tel Aviv and Haifa. Hebron, Jericho, Bethlehem are all in the Bible, Jewish cities. Haifa and Tel Aviv are not. And today, the majority of Jerusalem's Jewish population lies over the 1967 lines. Nobody even knows where those lines run today. I raised 3 kids down the street from those lines. They wouldn't know where those lines run. How could the city ever be redivided? And again, truth be told, I'm perhaps the last member of Israel's current coalition government to even use the term two-state solution. But even I have to ask two-state how and when. I'm in favor of giving the Palestinians the exact same opportunity we had. It took us 60 years to build our country, from the 1880s to 1940s. We didn't build it overnight. Let's give the Palestinians 60 years. But the truth is that if a Palestinian state were to be founded tomorrow, it would fall apart in a matter of weeks, days, maybe even hours. It would fall apart to Hamas at best, ISIS at worst. And the fact of the matter is, today, these truths that I've mentioned on both sides have become largely irrelevant in the conversation between so many American Jews and Israeli Jews. The list of issues that Israelis count about, I'm in politics, we do polling, all right? We actually find out what Israelis care about. Peace with the Palestinians comes in dead last. Far, far behind housing prices, the cost of living, basic security, dead last. The situation may be exactly reversed among liberal American Jews. By contrast, many American liberal Jews have what I would call a fetish about the Palestinians. They see the Palestinians as pristine victims, almost childlike in their freedom from any agency or responsibility. It's a fetish founded on almost total ignorance of Palestinian language, culture, history. Those same American liberal Jews may demand a two-state solution, but forget that the Palestinians hold the world's record for being offered a two-state solution, starting in 1947. And they rejected it every time, almost every time, with violence. American Jews often demand a two-state solution without asking, what have the Palestinians done to prepare for that type of state, other than to maintain a deeply corrupt, unelected, anti-Semitic government that subsidizes terrorists, teaches children to hate and kill, and denies the Holocaust. Other than that, they're perfectly ready for a state. And those same liberal American Jews may ignore the fact that the occupation which they consist is so brutal is a large part mythic. Go to Ramallah, go to Nablus, go to Jenin, and you won't see a single Israeli soldier. Where is that occupation? Too many American Jews ignore the fact that there already is an independent Palestinian state in Palestine. It's called Gaza. And it's run by a jihadist regime dedicated to the mass killing of Jews. How's that solution working out for you? The fact that a majority of American Jews opposed this administration, the current administration's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and to relocate the U.S. Embassy, the majority of American Jews opposed that, wounded a great many Israelis, some irreparably. And if for American Jews, the Palestinian issue is the most divisive, for Israelis, there is no more issue more infuriating, more alienating, and more hurtful than the issue of the Iranian nuclear deal. Now, I spent nearly 5 years in the most intimate discussions with our American allies about the Iranian nuclear deal I know the deal. Backwards, forwards, ups and downs. And let me give you the short version of it, because I could spend 2 hours just talking about the deal. Here's the deal, on one foot, if you will. In return for limiting itself to enriching 1 bomb's worth of highly enriched uranium, Iran got the right to enrich enough uranium at the end of 7 years to create hundreds of nuclear bombs. That's the deal. Meanwhile, under the deal, Iran kept its entire nuclear infrastructure. Not a single facility was dismantled, while Iran also retained the right to develop more advanced centrifuges that could enrich uranium at 4 times the current rate. Iran got to keep its blueprints for a nuclear weapon. The Libyans, the South Africans, they had to give that up, not Iran. Meanwhile, Iran could develop intercontinental ballistic missiles whose sole purpose is to carry nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, Iran could continue to conquer wide swaths of the Middle East, massacre tens of thousands of Syrians, and pursue its role as the world's leading state sponsor of terror. And Iran could pay for all of that with tens of billions of dollars in sanctions relief and international contracts. And finally, if that's all not enough, Iran could press its campaign to destroy the Jewish state, a genocidal agenda. Now, who with half a heart, to say nothing of a sound mind, could possibly support such a deal? And the answer is the majority of American Jews. Majority of American Jews. Now, I think I know why they did it. I think they wanted to believe the administration's line that the deal blocked Iran's path to the bomb, that the only alternative to the deal was wrong. None of that was true. The deal did not block Iran's path to the bomb. It paved Iran's path to the bomb. And the alternative to the deal was not war. The alternative to the deal was a better deal, one that actually dismantled Iran's nuclear program and denied it the ability to seek Israel's destruction. But the bulk of American Jews either didn't see it that way or were reluctant to take on a very popular American president. I understood that. And the partisan nature of the debate, as exemplified by Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech before Congress, only deepened that reluctance. But for whatever the reasons, American Jewish support for the deal was perceived by many Israelis and many high-ranking Israelis as a betrayal almost equal to that of World War II, when American Jews did not rally to save European Jewry. The scars are deep, and they are potentially permanent. And even more so now that another American Jewish majority opposed America's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. The majority of American Jews opposed the withdrawal. And if the nuclear issue still riles Israelis, American Jews are still reeling from my government's decision to withdraw from the Kotel arrangement. Full disclosure, I spent 2.5 years as ambassador negotiating that arrangement. It wasn't easy. It was a good agreement. It provided for an egalitarian prayer section in the southern part of the Kotel, the archaeological garden known as Robinson's Arch. But subsequent talks also provided for a joint entrance to both the northern and southern sections of the Kotel, as well as a supervisory committee comprised of representatives from the conservative movement, the reform movement, the Jewish Agency. Those second 2 conditions, which were not about equal prayer access, but about Israeli recognition of reform and conservative Jewry, about power, not about egalitarian prayer, were the ones that were rescinded by the government. They were the ones that got under the craw of the Haredim and put pressure on the government. The egalitarian prayer section, at least in theory, is still being built. We got problems with the archaeological people, we got problems with the Jordanians. The Jordanians don't like it. But still, the scar remains. And it was recently deepened by the arrest and questioning of conservative Rabbi Dov Hayun in Haifa for performing a non-Orthodox wedding. Now, for those of you who don't know, we do not have civil marriage in Israel. There's none in any Middle Eastern state, and not only because of the Jews, the imams and the priests would go crazy if we ever did that. But by law in Israel, all life events, birth, death, divorce, and yes, marriage, are under the exclusive control of the central rabbinate. The situation is opposed by a sizable number of Israelis, among them modern Orthodox Israelis, but I don't think it's about to change quickly. Israel is caught between two hallowed principles, pluralism and democracy. Pluralism mandates that Israelis should be able to marry in any ceremony, Reform, Conservative. But while there are relatively few Reform and Conservative Jews in Israel, there are immense numbers of ultra-Orthodox who vote and whose Knesset factions are essential for cobbling together coalitions. Not only the Likud, but the labor opposition is unwilling to challenge this status quo for that reason. So while I personally opposed my own government's decision to cancel 2/3 of the Kotel arrangement, while I protested Rabbi Hiyun's arrest and called him to express solidarity with him, while my own son was married by a Reform rabbi in the presence of President Shimon Peres, my voice is a relatively lone one. It's not that the synagogue that secular Israelis don't go to is an ultra-Orthodox synagogue. And it's not only, that's true, it's not only that politicians are reluctant to take on the ultra-Orthodox parties. Today there is a genuine resentment. We didn't consult with them about the Kotel, I've heard Israelis say, but they, liberal American Jews, didn't consult with us about patrilineal descent. They didn't consult with us about intermarriage ceremonies and Jews by choice. And these are decisions that profoundly impacted the nature of Jewish identity. What's all this noise surrounding joint prayer services at the Kotel? This is from a column that appeared this week in Ynet, Israel's leading online newspaper, by Noah Krieger. He's a columnist, popular columnist. What's all this noise surrounding joint prayer services at the Kotel? I don't know of any Jew who died of separate prayer services or of marriages performed by the rabbinate. Why does Israel have to keep up with the latest changes in American Jewry? What's wrong with preserving our ancient traditions? That's from a secular Israeli. They supported a nuclear deal that endangered my children. This is from one of my colleagues in government. Why should I give a damn where they pray? Truth is, relations between Israel and American Jewry are in many respects in crisis. And the crisis shows every sign of worsening. Several years ago, an Israeli expert on diaspora affairs, a man I respect enormously, told me that liberal American Jewish leaders who once mobilized support for their movements through Israel by galvanizing support from Israel have now moved to galvanizing support from their movement through anti-Israel activity. At the time, I laughed at that. I said, this can't be. And I got to tell you, I'm not laughing anymore. Today, some of those leaders act less like religious figures than heads of a party whose platform closely resembles the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And to the degree that Israel's policies don't conform to that platform, we are somehow no longer representing Jewish values. That's problematic enough. More so when elements of that same progressive wing accuse Israel of war crimes or begin to even question our right to exist. It's problematic when progressive activists won't allow women wearing a Magen David to march with them for LGBT rights, or when those activists claim that anti-Semitism is not really racism because Jews, like racism against African Americans and Hispanics because Jews are white and powerful. Not the same thing. The problem was recently illustrated by an unprecedented condemnation of Israel's Jewish state law. And this condemnation came from a strange place, the Jewish Federations of North America. It was unprecedented because, to the best of my knowledge, the Federation's not a political organization, and it was the first time, to my knowledge, that it interfered in a sovereign act of Israel's democratic system. It was unprecedented because federations were reacting, it seemed, predictably to predictably slanted New York Times coverage of that law, and bought into the myth that somehow this law was anti-democratic. I voted for that law I voted for that law. And I wasn't crazy about it. I would have preferred that it mentioned that Israel preserves equal rights for all of its citizens. But I also know that those rights are enshrined in dozens and dozens of other Israeli laws, including a basic law on human freedom and dignity. And by the way, it was the finding of Israel's Attorney General today that there's nothing remotely anti-democratic about this law, and the Israel Supreme Court will judge on it too. But that didn't prevent federations and others from rushing to condemn Israel for undermining its own democratic principles. Anybody doubting Israel's commitment to democracy only had to witness the demonstrations against the law in Rabin Square up the street, where Palestinians waving Palestinian flags called for the destruction of Israel through blood and sweat and tears. With blood and sweat and tears, we will redeem Palestine. And they were able to protest freely. That's a democracy. Finally, Federation's statement was unprecedented because it was made without consultation with Israeli officials, including this official. Admirably, the Federation will be holding its General Assembly in Israel in November. I hope some of you will come. It's being held under the slogan, "We should talk." You know this? It's like we're breaking up with a relationship. You ever had this? We should talk. But yes, we should talk. We should definitely talk, but begin by talking with us before you issue an unfair and inaccurate condemnation. And then we come to the latest and potentially most divisive issue of all in American Israel-Jewish relations. And how should I say this? It revolves around an individual, a president, who, how should I say this, tends to be unpopular among most liberal American Jews, but who heads, and this I will say unequivocally, the most pro-Israel administration since 1948. It's an administration whose support of Israel is across the board, because it's also not just the president, it's the Secretary of State, it's his National Security Advisor, it's his ambassador to the UN, that we have to then. And it's an administration that is stuck with us on issues that are absolutely vital to our national security, if not our survival. On Iran, Syria, Gaza, the Security Council. And yet, an administration whose pro-Israel actions on Jerusalem and Iran are opposed by some American Jews simply because this administration did them. I heard it over and over again. Because Trump did it, I'm going to oppose it. And so their resentment grows. American Jewish resentment toward Israel growing because for being too grateful to and too enamored of President Trump, and Israeli resentment of American Jews for not being grateful enough. And the result is this kind of hostile symmetry. American Jews who believe that Israel is moving ineluctably rightward, away from democracy, away from pluralistic values, preventing leftist American Jews from entering our airport, shutting ourselves off from the liberal Jewish world, and Israeli Jews who believe that American Jews have become irreversibly progressive, universalist, pacifistic, responsible for and they're responsible for most of the criticism of Israel in this country comes from American Jews. A growing number of Israeli leaders who are democratically elected are fed up with the criticism of American Jews who aren't democratically elected, and American Jews who've grown accustomed to criticizing Israel publicly, but have a hard time when Israelis criticize American Jews. They can dish it out, can't take it. Liberal American Jews, so this Israeli school holds, will never be with us politically today, or physically won't be with us in the future due to assimilation, so why invest in them? If we have resources, let's invest in our base, which is Orthodox and evangelical. That is the truth. That is the truth. That is the dangerous, bleak, and tragic truth. But it is not by any means the only truth. The other truth is that the same polls that indicate American Jewish dissatisfaction with Israeli policies also show that Israel remains a crucial component of American Jewish identity. We see that truth in diaspora donations, Russell, and investments in Israel that have built up Israeli industry with Israeli universities, our health centers, that have strengthened Israeli society immeasurably, that account for, get this, 6.5% of our GDP comes from diaspora Jewish investments and donations. That is the equivalent of our entire defense budget. We see it in the pro-Israel lobbies in Congress and in the White House that have helped secure tens of billions of dollars for our defense. We see it in more than 500,000 Jewish youth, most of them from North America, who have participated in Birthright. We see it again in October, where the largest delegation of Federation women will be visiting Israel. The other truth is that Israelis still care passionately about American Jews. And we see that truth in the more than 100,000 Israeli youths, most of them soldiers, who have accompanied Birthright trips to Israel, who have served as counselors in American Jewish camps. We see it in Israel's reverence for the many thousands of Jews from America who have served or are currently serving as lone soldiers in the IDF. 7,300, the size of a brigade today. I see it in the audiences I encounter across the state of Israel who agree with me when I tell them that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And as such, we have a responsibility to preserve that people, physically, spiritually, and to reach out, no matter how difficult, to those who are American Jews, even those Jews who disagree with us. We see that truth, but it is not enough merely to acknowledge it. We must build upon it. We must strengthen it. We must make it as much as possible the only truth. Urgently, we need to adopt new methods and initiatives. A few weeks ago, I met a friend of Leslie's, a young American Jewish woman studying from University of Pennsylvania. She was in Israel volunteering at a high-tech company. She had never been to Hillel on her campus. She wasn't involved in any Israel activity, but she bonded with Israeli high-tech and young Israeli technicians. We must expand that opportunities for Israeli and American Jewish young people to bond through a wide variety of venues, through technology, music, art, dance, environmental studies, sports. We must broaden the ability of young American Jews to participate in the more than 85 Israeli NGOs that deliver disaster relief, medical aid, saving hearts, saving eyes, saving lives in Africa and even in the Arab world. This is doing tikkun olam together. And we must enable Israelis to learn more about the realities of American Jewry. I've met so many young Israelis whose perspectives on American Jews have been completely altered by visiting an American Jewish community like this one and seeing firsthand the vitality and the diversity of American Jewish life. And while Israel must invest more seriously in Jewish education in the United States, American Jews should welcome and not be threatened by American Jewish aliyah to Israel. Some months ago, you may have heard this, I made a splash by relating to a journalist a conversation I'd had with the Prime Minister where I said that we should incentivize 10,000 American Jews to make aliyah every year. And what I was specifically referring to was non-religious American Jews. And I stressed that the definition should be those Jews who were least likely to have Jewish grandchildren. And I explained that this was Israel's responsibility as a Jewish state to preserve Jewish peoplehood on which it was predicated. And the report elicited some rather harsh reactions from here in the United States, charging that my initiative was somehow disrespectful of the reform and conservative movements. But wouldn't it have been better if instead of being insulted, those movements stood up and said, Hinenu, we're here to help? Would it have been better if the Jewish community in the United States as a whole blessed the 239, right? I got that number right? 239 American Jews I greeted some days ago at Ben Gurion Airport who were brought to Israel through the fabulous aegis of Nefesh B'Nefesh. Where were you 40 years ago when I needed you? Wouldn't it be better if American Jewish Aliyah were viewed here not as a threat, but as a way of creating a critical constituency in Israel that would work to strengthen ties between America and the Jewish state and someday actually make a political difference? Make a difference. There is so much we can do if we only determine to do it. Because Jewish peoplehood is precious, and it's a precious value in and of itself. Because yes, we all are unspeakably fortunate to be living now, at this time in our people's history, when two such vital and successful Jewish communities coexist. And because of what was written once upon a time in the sanctuary of this synagogue, the words of Psalm 145 that spoke to me as a kid and which has influenced my life ever since. The Lord is near to all who call upon him, to all who call upon him in truth. And through the truth, tough as it is sometimes, we will grow closer, closer to him, indeed, but also closer to one another as American and Israeli Jews. Through the truth, together, we will be near. Tauba.
What can the government do? What can we do? What can people do to fight what's going on within the Rabbanut and support Zohar and do something to try to move the Rabbanut to some
I support
level
Zohar
that makes
for
sense.
the record. Zohar is a group of modern Orthodox rabbis in Israel who have taken on the monopoly of the Rabbanut over life events such as marriage. I'm highly supportive of Rav Sav and Rav Rifkin. Just stay with us, okay? Eventually this is going to change. The situation as it exists now is non-sustainable. The entire Haredi lifestyle in Israel is not sustainable because they're growing too fast and there's just not enough resources to maintain it. So eventually it's going to change. And it's important that there'll be alternatives. I personally, I have not been a strong advocate of civil marriage in Israel. And I mentioned briefly why, because it's not only would it be problematic for Jews, it would also be problematic for Christians and Muslims. Oh boy, we'd have riots in the streets. There's no civil marriage anywhere in the Middle East. And that's just what I want to do is take on the imams and the priests. But I am strongly in favor of marriage by choice. That Israeli Jewish couples should have a choice of being married with a conservative rabbi, with a reform rabbi, and they shouldn't have to go to Cyprus.
When you were ambassador, what was the most intense moment you had? It could be picked one.
When I was embarrassed, what was the most intense moment I had? I have to sift through about 400 of them. So the entire period was one of immense challenge to the state of Israel and to our relationship. And you know, I can recommend a certain book that's going at discount prices, which will tell you about. It tells you about 30% of the story because you don't want to hear the whole story. It's like how hot dogs are made. You don't want to know, but it was an immensely challenging situation. I think some of the most difficult situations for me actually had to do with our relationship with the American Jewish community, because I felt it tore at my heartstrings, what was going on there, and is why I worked so hard to reach that agreement on the Kotel, which, by the way, I don't know if you remember this, the Reform and conservative rabbis rejected it at first, because they believed that the Kotel arrangement relegated them to sort of Class B Jews. Well, we're not good enough to pray at the Kotel? And it took a lot of convincing. And what the irony of it was, the tragic irony it was, that once it was published, the Reform Conservative movement rallied around the agreement, and the Haredim came out against it. Haredim did not raise any objection to that the entire time, including the Rav Kotel. No objection whatsoever until it became public. Very, very painful for me personally.
The vast majority, and you say liberal American Jews, as opposed to just American Jews, were in favor of the Iran deal and are against Trump's ripping up of the Iran. So here you have the juxtaposition, as you stated, of American Jewry on the other side of Israelis who believe something is an existential threat to their existence. How do you explain that?
How can we explain this dichotomy? And that's saying that's kind of the dichotomy of Israelis who say this agreement jeopardizes the lives of our children and grandchildren. And by the way, I cannot say that more pointedly. It endangered the lives of our children and grandchildren. Okay? And an American Jewry that, for the most part, is supportive of this deal. And the short answer is, again, that the administration made a very compelling case that it stopped Iran's path to the bomb, that the only alternative to this deal was war. Neither of that was true. But the administration made a much more effective argument. I always give students, those who are so interested, an assignment of reading President Obama's address to the Jerusalem Conservative Congregation, in which I was a member during my time in Washington. And he gave a speech there to a full house about the Iran nuclear deal. And he made what in philosophy is known as a syllogism. A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. And what was the syllogism? My liberal values led me to bring about the Iran nuclear deal. My liberal values are Jewish values. Therefore, if you have Jewish values, you have to support the Iran nuclear deal. And that was the message, not so subtly made again and again and again. And by the way, the codicil, if you will, to that syllogism is that we in Israel did not represent Jewish values. And Benjamin Netanyahu did not represent Jewish values. His values were Jewish values. It was a very compelling argument. I do not think we did a very good job of explaining ourselves. I have the dubious distinction, again, of being one of the few people to oppose Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech in Congress. I can't say he's forgiven me since then. And for that reason, and I think and I've heard since then from American Jewish leaders to the degree to which the administration put a full court press to convince them. And yet, when it came for the Israelis to explain ourselves, we did a poor job. And I can't overlook the fact that we bear part of the responsibility for that. But it does not change the reality is that there's a deep and abiding resentment that is not being forgotten. And I know that some of the decisions made about our relationship with the American Jewish community have been influenced in a profound way by that resentment. There were many, many questions asked about the alternatives to the two-state solution. I'll recommend an article I wrote some years ago in the Wall Street Journal called The Two-State Reality, which I think has had a certain impact on the Trump administration's thinking about the peace process. It's basically saying that in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, we have a Palestinian state there. It's not a state in the Weberian sense of full sovereignty, but the fact of the matter is, again, we're not building settlements in downtown Ramallah and Jenin. There is a Palestinian state there. I think we can expand on it. I think we can expand on it maybe territorially, but certainly in terms of its autonomy. And there's the basis. And I think that is a widely held view today. As for dignity, I think dignity is something you're not given. Dignity is something you earn. And I may sound harsh here, but one of the great achievements of the Zionist movement, one of the great achievements, in 1971, Leslie, when did Kahana speak here? 72. Kahana spoke, and he came here with the guys with the clubs and the berets, and they talked about Jewish victimhood and how we had to rise up and defend ourselves against anti-Semitism. I think one of the crowning achievements of Israel and the Zionist movement is that we have moved away from that sense of victimhood. Yes, we have Yad Vashem. Yes, we have Holocaust Remembrance Day. Yes, we have the March of the Living, but that is not what we are about. We are not about suffering. We are about creativity. We are about family. We are about values, though we may have some disagreements about what those values are. That's what Israel's about. That is our achievement. The day that the Palestinians cease being about being victims and start thinking about positive elements in their identity, I think that's the day they'll achieve that dignity. And it's something that we can give them It's something they have to achieve themselves, no gain it. I wish fervently that they will. I wish fervently they will. I just would leave you with the thought that I began tonight. Let us this year be thankful. Let us say from the bottom of our hearts, Todah Rabbah, that we live where we live at this time in our history. He knew a different time in history. Let us be thankful. Let's all say Todah.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.